Hi, I'm Jane McCallion.
And I'm Adam Shepherd.
Welcome to the ITPro Podcast, your weekly guide to the most important topics in the IT industry. So, Adam, I understand that you've been involved in a small building project this week.
I have. I've finally pulled the trigger on building a new gaming PC, which I alluded to in last week's episode. So I spent Monday constructing and configuring that, which was an educational experience for someone who's never really done it before.
Educational in a good way or a bad way?
In a good way, largely. I managed to slice my finger open and bleed all over my motherboard, but aside from that, it was a fairly smooth process.
It sounds like some kind of ritual that's involved with creating your first PC.
Yeah, I've consecrated my new build to the chaos gods in the interests of more frame rate. Shout out also to James Archer of Computer Shopper for helping me troubleshoot some of the more trickier water cooling issues. So huge thanks to him for that, friend of the podcast.
Well, moving on from your blood bonds with your new computer, later on in the show we'll be talking about how to create a viable scale-up with special guest Gavin Scruby, CIO of SmartDebit. But first of all, let's talk about this week's top news stories.
The most interesting story this week, Dr. Liam Fox, the former International Trade Secretary, was hacked by suspected Russia-linked cybercriminals.
Yes, so if you can cast your minds back to the 2019 election, when the Labour Party created a dossier that was used kind of as part of their campaign, it turns out that the information that was contained in that came from Liam Fox and was taken from his personal email account.
Several caches of documents were stolen via spearfishing attacks. And for those that aren't familiar, spearfishing is highly targeted phishing attacks which leverage things like customized text and calls to action in emails to compromise a specific target. Now, this is often CFOs or HR executives, people within organizations who have access to sensitive systems and sensitive data, much like the data that was lifted over the course of this attack.
Indeed, and presumably if he was using a personal email account rather than a, well, not corporate, but a parliamentary one, professional one, then there would be kind of less protection against it. And I guess that was kind of the point. A lesson as ever in why you shouldn't use your personal email for business stuff, especially not for sensitive business things, which this very much was, because it turns out that the information involved was apparently about UK-US trade negotiations, which obviously is a big part of what on earth we're going to do after Brexit.
Now, government officials and ministers in general don't tend to have the best record when it comes to their own kind of digital literacy. There was that rather ignominious incident a couple of years ago when an MP was fired for using a parliamentary computer to allegedly look up illicit porn. He, of course, protested his innocence and claimed that it was one of his aides or similar. But it underlines the fact that a lot of ministers don't necessarily have the best digital skills themselves, which is why they absolutely should not be using personal, any kind of personal accounts, whether that's email or other services, to process and store sensitive information. And it does make you wonder what other caches of information are being stored in personal, very poorly secured accounts across the country.
Indeed. Now, as you alluded to at the beginning, the hack was allegedly carried out by Russia-linked cybercriminals. So the whole thing of Russia-linked is that, particularly with that country, hackers are not directly related to or part of the GRU or the FSB, which introduces an element of plausible deniability for the Russian government. But let's just say that not an awful lot is being done there to stop them either. But it's a different kind of MO, if you will, or strategy situation than, say, North Korea or China, where it seems to be much more closely linked to the actual government.
It's also notable that these kind of suspected Russian operations generally tend to focus on information warfare and destabilization rather than the more direct financial attacks that are frequently pinned on North Korea and China through the theft of things like, Bitcoin, crypto miners, and the theft of trade secrets, which are then leveraged for government gain, essentially.
Yeah. In slightly more light-hearted news, Apple has released a new 27-inch iMac. Now, this isn't the first 27-inch iMac that has ever been released, of course, but it has new innards, notably a 10th generation Comet Lake Intel processor, paired with AMD's Radeon Pro 5000 series graphics, and with up to 16 gigabytes of memory and at least 256 gigabytes of SSD storage.
It also features one of Apple's newer innovations, the T2 security chip, which supports enhanced encryption, secure boots, and other security-focused hardware features.
Yes, and on the more visible side of it, it has a Retina 5K display and all-new 1080p webcam. Apple is claiming that it is the most powerful Mac ever, and, I mean, you're the reviews editor here, but that sounds like a reasonable claim.
I mean, yes. The Mac Pro still absolutely dwarfs it, of course, but then it's a slightly different use case. Apple's iMacs across the board, at the top end anyway, are generally the most powerful all-in-ones that you can get, particularly, without going into really exorbitant sums of money. And particularly when Apple's often pegged as being bad value, particularly in the iMac range, because when you get into the higher configurations, you're looking at $2,000-3,000 in total for the machine. But what people often forget is it's got a 5K display built in, and a really good one at that, which is something that off the shelf you would be paying a good £600-700 for at least, if not upwards of £1,000. And to have that built in for the for the cost of entry, it's actually really quite good in terms of value.
Yeah, and my personal experience with Macs has always been that they last as well. They keep getting updated for really quite a long time. I've got a Mac upstairs that I don't even think how old it is, but it's on the latest operating systems. It kind of works fine, and I've had it for a good long while.
That's an early 2013 one, unless I miss my guess.
Quite possibly. But it runs fine. That's what I care about.
You can tell which one of us is the reviews editor. This doesn't look like an especially transformative upgrade. I mean, there's a reason it was released as a kind of press release rather than a big flashy showcase event like Apple generally does with its kind of most significant releases. But it's a welcome update for Mac users and for Apple fans, and I'm sure that we will see many home office workers lusting after one of these in the coming months.
And finally, former Waymo engineer Anthony Levandowski has been sentenced to 18 months in jail after having admitted to stealing sensitive and confidential documents from his former employer and taking them to Uber.
Levandowski was one of the co-founders of what became Waymo, which started as an internal project in Google's secretive X labs that it uses for what it dubs moonshots, kind of very ambitious cutting-edge projects, much like self-driving cars. He started the project, but then defected to Uber's own self-driving robotic car initiative and took a large chunk of his research and documentation with him, something that is in fact illegal.
Yeah, and it does sound like it was pretty blatant as well. Put it onto his work laptop, took the work laptop, and off he goes to Uber. Now, it's important to note that there is no indication that Uber knew what he had done at all, and he has been at the sharp end of some legal proceedings from that company as well as Alphabet. Apparently, Levandowski had been hoping for 12 months house arrest, but the judge, who was District Judge William Alsop, said that doing so would give a green light to every future brilliant engineer to steal trade secrets. So, I mean, that's a very backhanded compliment there as well.
Well, in other backhanded compliments, Alsop called Lewandowski's act the biggest trade secret crime he had ever seen, which is certainly an ignominious record to hold.
Yes, and considering he sits in San Francisco, he has presumably seen a number of trade secret crimes going on. Not that I have anything against Silicon Valley, but if there's going to be some IP theft happening, I imagine that it would be there.
Well, absolutely. And the history of Silicon Valley is absolutely rife with backstabbing and trade secret theft and founders undercutting each other and all sorts of shenanigans.
Yeah, I mean, it's like I say, it's a quite kind of blatant, vaguely old school way of doing an attempted or indeed apparently successful theft of confidential documents, trade secrets, by loading it onto a piece of hardware and taking that. Although I believe traditionally, as pictured in various films and so on, you put it on a thumb drive. Maybe that was his falling point.
What I'd like to know is how conscious Lewandowski was that what he was doing was actually a crime. Because, as you say, it is a very blatant way to steal trade secrets. I mean, most organizations, when an employee is leaving the business, require employees to hand back all of their IT equipment for exactly this reason. And it does make you wonder whether or not he knew he was committing a crime rather than just thinking, well, I'm going to take all of my existing research to my old job because it's my research and I did it and that's perfectly reasonable.
I think he obviously realised what he was doing was wrong. You surely can't work in Silicon Valley and not know, or like just business, and not know that what he was doing was wrong. But yeah, I think possibly some level of justification of, well, I did this work, why should they benefit from it when, it's my research and I shouldn't have to just leave it here, might be in play.
We're going to take a short ad break now, but when we come back, we will be talking to SmartDebit CIO Gavin Scruby about how you go from a startup to a scale-up and the perils that can come with that.
See you after the break. Welcome back. In the tech industry in particular, but in business in general, there's often a focus on smaller companies and startups. While this is an important part of the national economic ecosystem, most startup founders dream not of remaining small business owners, but following the steps of people such as Steve Jobs, Sergey Brin, Larry Page, Jack Ma, or Mark Zuckerberg, to name just a few. So, what are the keys from moving from a successful startup to a successful scale-up? Here to discuss this with us is Gavin Scruby, CIO of SmartDebit. Gavin, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So, Gavin, before we dive into the meat of this topic, I wonder if you can give us a little bit of background on yourself and SmartDebit.
My whole career has been in science and technology across a range of industries and organisation types. I've done most of the jobs in tech, from programming to service management to project management, and I've done a fair bit of mergers and acquisition work as well. And that's been across everything from one-man bands to 5,000-person consortium programs. Originally, I wanted to be a scientist, so I did a PhD in machine learning before it was called AI back in those days. And then I moved into industrial algorithm research and then a more conventional IT path through software and management and mergers and acquisition and that kind of thing. After some stints at really big IT companies working on absolutely massive projects, I realized I worked much better at smaller but growing organizations, and that's what I've been doing ever since. So that's what led me to become CIO and director at SmartDebit. They needed somebody to help them scale the business and particularly scale the technology. SmartDebit even then was a successful recurring payments provider, and we process about $3.5 billion a year. And we squarely fit into that scale-up category of fintech. We're growing at 20% revenue. We've doubled the team size over the last 4 years. It's a really exciting time to be there, and it's something that really suits me because I get to experience all aspects of the business as well as the technology. And I can take what I've learnt across other businesses and really drive it forwards.
So, Gavin, some companies seem to hold on to their startup status for quite a long time. 5, 7, I've even come across companies that are like 10 years old who still describe themselves as startups. Why do you think this is?
That's actually a really interesting question. It's not something I really ever considered as being a thing before, but now you say it, I can see that's true. I think in many cases in tech, this is a combination of internal culture and external perception. It's not something material to the business itself. Startups are cool. They've got potential, people want to work there, and they're great for attracting new staff. Founders are also pretty reluctant to change this. The cultural change in a company that's needed during scaling is one of the most challenging parts of that journey. I always say to people, a huge hidden difficulty is that culture is the hardest part of your organization to scale. It's harder to scale more than tech, more than process, more than funding. And more companies fail to scale because the people fail to scale almost more than any other aspect. And it's usually hidden unless you look at it directly. There's also an external view for remaining a startup, particularly when you're talking to investors. Because if investors feel a company is on the cusp of some kind of accelerated growth, it can gain the company much better multiples on their valuation. So being a startup is a much better story than saying you're a long-term steady state or you're struggling to grow and change at any point in your journey. This perception isn't unique to companies, though. When I was thinking about this the other night, it's pretty universal. You see actors classed as overnight successes, and they've been working in the industry for 20 years. The other thing to think about is that this startup scale-up thinking is closely linked with the tech industry, and it's built its definitions on quite a narrow range of company types overall. I know we're talking primarily about tech here, but I've worked with many organizations outside of tech, for example, things like vehicle leasing, truck repairs, even garden nurseries, where the distinction between a startup and a scale-up is not really relevant, and the structures don't fit the shape of the staff-heavy, low-asset, subscription-based models that we use in technology.
Yeah.
That's really interesting, particularly the comparison with, actors and so-called overnight successes. I'd never really considered that parallel before. But how would you describe a scale-up? What sets them apart from a startup? Is it simply the intention to grow, or are there other factors?
There are lots of standard definitions, and they work pretty well for the most part. They are high-growth companies. They grow 20% or more in either employment or turnover year on year for a few years, and they've usually got a minimum employee count of about 10 to start with, to separate them from startups. There are more nuanced ways of looking at it, about the feel of the company. They help define its status, separate from the simple accounting views. So in my experience, a scale-up is much more exciting to be in than a startup. When you're a startup, and of course this does depend on your funding model, you're frantically running around doing everything from coding to doing the books to making the tea and the washing up. You've got limited resources, you've got limited time and options, you've got to hire who you can get, which isn't always a perfect way to run things. Conversely, when you're in a much, much larger organization, you hire lots of specialists in different areas because you've got job roles, you've got structure, and you want to fill them with the right kinds of people. Communication gets more siloed, specialists don't really follow what each other can do and don't understand each other, and you end up with lots more politics creeping in. And I think, in my experience, that's almost inevitable when you get to 100 or even 200 staff. For me, the best place to be is a scale-up. You don't have the end-of-month cash flow panic. You're not trying to do 5 people's jobs. You've got more time and resource to plan what you want to do. And at that point, you want to hire multi-skilled people, and that's the feeling you get when you go into a scale-up. You see there are lots of people with multi-skills, multi-talents who want to be working across various parts of that business. Another sign of the scale-up is when the leaders of the company stop thinking of the technology they sell as their business, but the technology they sell enables their business. So a good example of that is Google. They started by creating the tech that made the best search engine. It was all about the coding, all about the algorithms. As they scaled, they saw that their business wasn't really that tech. The business was organizing data for people to make it useful and accessible. So once you change that mindset, you can really see what your business is about, and that's when you're in a scale-up mindset.
So is there a point at which then business founders should think, right, okay, we're moving in this direction, let's be a scale-up, let's do this? Or is it something that happens a bit more organically than that?
It's really hard to think about that in terms that are general, because every company is different. Is the company subscription-based? Is it service-based? Does it shift widgets? Does it rely on increasing numbers of people to scale like a consultancy does? What's the market like? What's the funding situation? As well as that, unless you have a definition that everybody agrees on, which they don't, it comes down to perception, self-perception, external perception. I think you should consider when you want to move gears, change the size all the time, even from the outset of the company. That doesn't mean to say you should plan to change, just be aware that you are making that decision and not be a passenger in that decision making. Some businesses are lifestyle businesses. People work for fun, they don't want to change. Sometimes scaling up is too hard with the business model or market the company is in. So the only options are changing the business model, changing the market, or getting extra investment. Sometimes it can even be nudge factors that change a company. So SmartDebit, for example, could only really be called a scale up for the last 5 or 6 years of its 20-year history. It was working really nicely for most of those years, but it changed when the CEO and chairman decided to bring in more specialist board members like me to drive it forwards. So there was a conscious decision to change and reinvest more into the business, and that's really made a difference. So really, I suppose what I'm trying to say is you've got to put aside what you feel a startup or scale up means and the vague distinction between them, and work through the 3 most important stages of planning. Where are you? Where do you want to get to? And what are your options for getting there? The point at which you should really supercharge and go from a startup to a scale up kind of automatically falls out of that.
So speaking of reinvesting, what are the kind of costs that can be associated with going from a startup to a scale up? I mean, things like increased staffing costs are the obvious costs that come to mind, but are there any other areas that businesses need to proactively invest in if they're looking to take that next step?
As you mentioned, staffing is a key component. You've got to get very broad, multi-skilled staff to be able to scale up properly, because those people have to look across different parts of the business and not be siloed. On top of that, you've got to look at how you're expanding your market. So if you're increasing and scaling your business, you just need to know where that's going to scale to. Often that means you're moving into a market with higher levels of regulation with bigger customers. So your investment has to be in those systems and processes that provide the regulatory approval, provide the systems that handle larger customers. A lot of that will be around compliance, it'll be around security, things like stronger web application firewalls and anti-DDoS systems. Having all of that in place is often needed before those larger customers will even look at you. So that will limit your growth unless you're investing in that area.
So Gavin, if it's possible, if you were to give one piece of advice to startup founders looking to take the next step in growing their business, what would that be?
The way I think about company growth is it's like mountain climbing. There are lots of routes to get to the top, but they all have the same pitfalls and risks. You can't look at any company in the same way when you're looking at what you should do, but there are lots of ways you can look at companies in saying what you can't do and what you shouldn't do. What I often do with people is highlight the pitfalls that apply to everybody, and that's quite a big list, so it's not really one piece of advice. But certainly concentrating on those risks is far better than concentrating on what you should do, because if you've dealt with those risks, you can then think about any plan you've got, and it's much easier to implement.
So while you say that maybe there's too many to list in full, are there any kind of the biggest pitfalls that really everybody should be looking out for?
I've mentioned some of them already. Don't think your technology is your business. Otherwise, you'll never be able to scale or grow properly. Don't hire for specific skills at that stage when you're trying to do a scale up. Get the right people, the right attitude who can flex. On top of that, there are things like don't try and hold on to your startup culture. That culture has to change as you grow. And I've seen so many people try and hold on to that, and it does stop them growing the company.
Arguably, that's the problem that Uber ran into a couple of years ago.
You see it so much because it's so cool, it's so trendy, and it's so nice to work at a startup. You don't want to let go of that comfort blanket, but you have to change your mentality as you grow a company.
Well, that's all we've got time for this week, but I'd like to say thank you once again to Gavin for joining us.
Thanks, Adam. Thanks, Jane. It was great talking to you today.
You can find links to all of the topics we've spoken about today in the show notes, and even more on our website, www.itpro.co.uk.
You can also follow us on Twitter at ITPro, as well as Facebook and LinkedIn.
If you've enjoyed today's discussion on scale-ups, why not also sign up to receive ITPro 2020, our digital magazine? This month is all about startups and small business, and we'll include a subscription link in the show notes.
Don't forget to subscribe to the ITPro podcast on your podcast platform of choice to never miss an episode. And if you can, leave us a rating and a review. We'll be back next week with more news and analysis from the world of IT. But until then, goodbye.
Bye.
The ITPro Podcast is brought to you by the Dennis Podcast Network.